As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the Thompsons' backyard, the family's celebration was back in full swing. Plates were being refilled. Kids were running around with newfound energy, and the faint hum of music set the perfect backdrop for laughter and conversation. The earlier disruption seemed like a distant memory, leaving behind only a quiet sense of triumph and unity. Marcus stood by the grill, turning the last batch of ribs and burgers with his usual finesse. The smoke swirled lazily into the air, carrying with it the mouth-watering aroma of his secret barbecue sauce. Jamal and Kayla sat nearby, their plates piled high as they exchanged playful jabs about who had eaten the most. LaToya joined Marcus at the grill, a glass of iced tea in hand. "You're the only person I know who can keep their cool while flipping burgers and handling a situation like that," she said, her voice a mix of pride and amusement. Marcus chuckled, shaking his head. "It's just about staying calm and letting the truth speak for itself. People like Mrs. Karen, they don't need you to argue with them. They need you to show them who you are without saying a word." LaToya smiled, leaning into him for a moment. "Well, you did that beautifully. And now," she added, raising her voice slightly, "are those ribs ready? Or should I tell everyone the judge is holding up dinner?" The group erupted in laughter as Marcus raised the tongs in mock surrender. All right. Dinner's ready, and I'm not about to let my title slow down the feast." As everyone gathered to grab their plates, Marcus glanced at the fence separating their yard from Mrs. Karen's house. With a mischievous twinkle in his eye, he raised his voice just enough to be heard. "Maybe we should save a plate for Mrs. Karen," he said, his tone light-hearted. "I think she could use some of my famous ribs to brighten her evening." The guests burst into laughter, some shaking their heads in disbelief at Marcus's ability to keep things so light. Even LaToya rolled her eyes, though she couldn't suppress her grin. "Or better yet," Marcus continued, "maybe we'll save a plate for the officers who stopped by." They seemed pretty impressed by the setup here. Might as well let them taste what all the fuss was about. Jamal nearly choked on his drink from laughing so hard. "Dad, you're too much." "Hey, I'm just trying to be neighborly," Marcus replied with a wink, flipping the last burger onto a tray. As the laughter settled and the family dug into their meals, the mood shifted slightly. It wasn't somber, but reflective, a quiet acknowledgement of the deeper meaning behind the day's events. LaToya raised her glass, signaling for everyone's attention. "To family," she said, her voice steady, "and to the strength it takes to handle challenges with grace. I couldn't be prouder of all of us today." The guests raised their glasses in unison, their cheers echoing through the backyard. Marcus added his own thoughts, his tone calm yet powerful. "To knowing who we are," he said, looking around at his family and friends, "and never letting anyone else define us, no matter what." As the group clinked their glasses, the moment felt profound. It was more than just a toast. It was a declaration of resilience, a reminder of their strength as individuals and as a community. The celebration continued into the evening, the sounds of joy carrying into the warm summer night. At one point, Marcus and Jamal teamed up to play a spirited game of basketball against two cousins, while Kayla orchestrated an impromptu dance competition with the younger kids. LaToya sat with her sister and a few friends, sharing stories and laughter that seemed endless. From the window of her house, Mrs. Karen watched quietly, her face thoughtful. The laughter and music that had once irritated her now seemed to carry a different tone, one of unity, joy, and resilience. She turned away, unsure of what to do with the mix of emotions stirring within her. Back in the Thompsons' yard, Marcus sat down for a moment, taking in the scene. He watched his kids, his wife, and his friends, all basking in the warmth of the evening and the strength of their bond. "You okay, Dad?" Jamal asked, plopping down beside him. Marcus smiled, resting a hand on his son's shoulder. "I'm more than okay, son," he said. This is what matters. Always remember that." Jamal nodded, his face glowing with admiration. "I will." As the night deepened and the stars began to dot the sky, the Thompsons' barbecue became more than just a family gathering. It was a celebration of triumph, of standing strong in the face of adversity, and of knowing that joy, love, and grace were the ultimate answers to any challenge. And through it all, the laughter never stopped. She trailed off, her words caught in her throat as Marcus's steady gaze remained fixed on her. Her usual composure was completely gone, replaced by a fumbling attempt to salvage her dignity. I didn't know who you were," she added, as if that explained everything. Marcus tilted his head slightly, his expression measured. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm and deliberate. "You didn't need to know who I was. That shouldn't have mattered." The words, spoken without anger but with undeniable weight, hung in the air. Mrs. Karen shifted uncomfortably, clasping her hands in front of her. "You're right," she admitted quietly. "It was a mistake, and I'm sorry for any trouble I caused." LaToya, standing a few steps behind Marcus, raised an eyebrow but said nothing. She simply turned back to the table, resuming her task of arranging plates and condiments, her silence speaking volumes. Marcus looked at Mrs. Karen for a moment longer before offering a polite nod. "Thank you for the apology," he said evenly. "Now, if you'll excuse us, my family and I have a barbecue to get back to." It wasn't a dismissal laced with malice, but it was firm and final. Mrs. Karen hesitated, as though she wanted to say more, but the quiet confidence in Marcus's tone left no room for further conversation. She took a step back, then another, retreating slowly toward her own yard. Her face flushed with embarrassment. She finally turned and disappeared around the corner of her house, leaving the Thompsons to their gathering. Once she was out of sight, the guests exchanged glances, a few shaking their heads with incredulous smiles. Jamal and Kayla, standing near the grill, looked up at their father, their admiration for him evident in their wide eyes. "That was awesome, Dad," Jamal said, breaking the silence with a grin. Marcus chuckled softly and ruffled his son's hair. "It's not about being awesome," he said. "It's about standing your ground with grace and dignity. Always remember that." The moment seemed to galvanize the group. Conversations resumed, laughter erupted, and the scent of barbecue once again filled the air. The earlier tension felt like a distant memory, replaced by a renewed sense of connection and joy. LaToya walked over to Marcus, placing a hand on his arm. "You handled that perfectly," she said with a proud smile. Marcus shrugged lightly, a small smile tugging at his lips. "She needed to learn a lesson. I hope she takes something from it." As the family settled back into their celebration, the sounds of music and laughter grew louder, more vibrant. The Thompsons had reclaimed their day, their joy undiminished by the events that had unfolded. And from her window, Mrs. Karen watched silently, the sounds of the barbecue drifting into her home as a reminder of the lesson she would not soon forget. As the family and guests began to settle back into the rhythm of the barbecue, a figure emerged from the side yard. Mrs. Karen, her shoulders slightly hunched and her face tinged with visible embarrassment, approached hesitantly. Her steps were slow, her usual brisk confidence replaced by awkward hesitation. Marcus noticed her before she reached the gate, but didn't immediately acknowledge her presence. Instead, he turned to LaToya, who was adjusting the serving table. She met his gaze, her expression calm but edged with subtle disdain for the neighbor's intrusion. Mrs. Karen cleared her throat softly, drawing the attention of a few guests. A murmur of recognition rippled through the group, though no one addressed her directly. All eyes eventually turned to Marcus, who finally turned to face her, his posture unchanging. "Mr. Thompson," Mrs. Karen began, her voice faltering slightly. I, I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I didn't mean for things to escalate like this. I didn't realize. She thought about apologizing again, but she knew it wasn't the right time. Perhaps it never would be. Some mistakes couldn't be undone with a few simple words. As the evening wore on, Mrs. Karen sat alone in her quiet home, reflecting on the day's events. The world outside continued without her. The sound of laughter, the faint hum of music, the scent of barbecue wafting through the air. And for the first time, Mrs. Karen let it be. The officers, now fully aware of who Marcus Thompson was and the baseless nature of the complaint, turned their attention back to him with respectful tones. Officer Miller cleared his throat, offering a small, apologetic smile. "Judge Thompson, we want to apologize for the interruption," he said, his voice steady but sincere. "There's clearly no issue here. Everything seems perfectly in order." Marcus gave a polite nod, his demeanor calm but firm. "I appreciate that, officer. I understand you were responding to a call, but as you can see, my family and I are just enjoying our time together. Nothing more, nothing less." Officer Daniels chimed in, his tone carrying a mix of respect and regret. "We're sorry for any inconvenience this caused, and, sir, thank you for your service to the community. I know firsthand how much your programs have helped people, my family included." The acknowledgement wasn't lost on Marcus, who offered a brief but gracious smile. "Thank you. I'm glad to hear that." With a final handshake, the officers turned and made their way back to their vehicles, the tension that had clouded the backyard dissipating in their wake. The flashing lights faded as the police cars pulled away, leaving behind a sense of relief and quiet triumph. As the police officers walked away, their expressions filled with respect and admiration for Marcus Thompson, Mrs. Karen stood frozen in place. The words, "Judge Thompson," echoed in her mind, each repetition making her stomach churn. Her once confident posture slumped, and the self-assured smirk that had adorned her face earlier was now replaced by a mixture of shock and disbelief. For a moment she glanced at Marcus, who had returned to his family, calm and composed, as though the entire ordeal had been nothing more than a passing inconvenience. He greeted his wife and children with a reassuring smile, resuming his role as the steady figure of the household. But Mrs. Karen could hardly move. Her thoughts swirled with the implications of what had just unfolded. This man, this neighbor she had called the police on, assuming the worst, was not only a law-abiding citizen, but a respected pillar of the community, a judge, a community leader, a man whose name carried weight far beyond the walls of his backyard. Her chest tightened as she remembered the way she had described the gathering to the dispatcher. Suspicious activity. Unsafe. A disturbance. She'd exaggerated every detail, her irritation guiding her words more than facts. And for what? To interrupt a family barbecue because it didn't fit her narrow idea of peace and quiet? Mrs. Karen's gaze darted toward the Thompsons' backyard, where the atmosphere was returning to normal. Laughter and conversation resumed, though it carried a sharper edge now, a sense of triumph perhaps, or the resilience of people who had faced baseless accusations with dignity and grace. She took a hesitant step forward, as if considering approaching Marcus. Apologizing, perhaps, explaining herself. But with each step, her confidence wavered. What could she possibly say? How could she justify her actions without sounding even more petty and prejudiced? LaToya noticed Mrs. Karen lingering near the gate and raised an eyebrow, her expression cool, but not unkind. Marcus, too, glanced in her direction, his eyes meeting hers briefly before he turned back to his family. It was a subtle but deliberate gesture, one that seemed to say, "You're not worth my time." The weight of his silent dismissal hit her harder than any words could have. Mrs. Karen clenched her hands tightly, her mind racing for an exit strategy. She had always prided herself on being an upstanding member of the neighborhood, someone who followed the rules and ensured others did too. But in this moment, she was acutely aware that she had crossed a line. A small voice in her mind tried to defend her actions. I didn't know he was a judge. I was just trying to maintain order. But the excuses rang hollow even to her. Whether or not she knew who Marcus was, she had assumed the worst about him and his family based on nothing more than a backyard barbecue. Her thoughts flashed to the way the officers had treated Marcus once they recognized him. Their respect for him was undeniable, and their subtle shift in tone had been impossible to ignore. And yet, what had she done? She had tried to reduce this accomplished man to nothing more than a nuisance, simply because she felt inconvenienced by his presence. The realization was a bitter pill to swallow. Mrs. Karen turned away from the backyard, retreating toward her house. Her steps were slower now, less purposeful. She didn't slam the door behind her as she usually did. Instead, she closed it quietly and leaned against it, letting out a shaky breath. Inside the safety of her pristine home, the silence felt suffocating. She wandered to the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of water with trembling hands. As she sipped, her reflection in the glass window caught her attention. She saw herself clearly for the first time, not the upstanding neighbor she imagined, but a woman blinded by her own biases, her actions rooted in assumptions rather than facts. The faint sound of laughter drifted through the window, reminding her of the scene she had interrupted. It wasn't a disturbance. It was joy. It wasn't unsafe. It was a family cherishing their time together. Mrs. Karen slumped into a chair, her mind replaying Marcus's calm yet pointed words. You didn't need to know who I was. This is my home. My family and I have the same right to enjoy a peaceful afternoon as anyone else. The truth of those words settled heavily on her shoulders. For the first time, Mrs. Karen felt ashamed, not just of her actions today, but of the mindset that had led her to make the call in the first place. Marcus nodded again, his voice humble. I'm glad to hear that. It's a team effort, really, but I'm proud to have been part of it. At this, the officers exchanged a quick glance. The tension that had lingered moments ago seemed to dissolve, replaced by a palpable sense of admiration. It wasn't every day that they encountered someone of Marcus's stature in such unexpected circumstances. From her spot near the back gate, Mrs. Karen's expression shifted from smug satisfaction to one of disbelief. She looked between the officers and Marcus, her mouth opening and closing as though struggling to form words. Judge? She finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. The officers turned briefly to look at her, their faces unreadable. Miller cleared his throat, stepping forward slightly. Ma'am, he said in a measured tone, it appears there's been a misunderstanding. Judge Thompson and his family are simply enjoying a barbecue. There's no disturbance here, and certainly nothing suspicious. Mrs. Karen's face turned crimson, the realization of her mistake settling heavily on her. She stammered, I didn't know. Marcus turned to face her, his expression calm but firm. You didn't need to know who I was, he said quietly. This is my home. My family and I have the same right to enjoy a peaceful afternoon as anyone else. The weight of his words seemed to hang in the air. Mrs. Karen looked down, unable to meet his gaze. Daniels spoke up again, his voice now carrying a note of apology. Judge Thompson, we appreciate your cooperation. We're sorry for any inconvenience this has caused. Marcus nodded politely. Thank you, officers. I understand you're just doing your job. Miller extended a hand, which Marcus shook firmly. For what it's worth, Miller said sincerely, it's an honor to meet you. The work you've done for this community is incredible. Daniels echoed the sentiment, adding, and for veterans like my uncle, too. Thank you for everything. Marcus offered a small smile. I'm just doing what I can. We all have a role to play." As the officers turned to leave, Mrs. Karen stood frozen, her embarrassment evident. She started to mumble an apology, but Marcus, with characteristic grace, turned his back and walked toward his family. The Thompsons' backyard erupted in quiet applause, a mix of pride and relief washing over the gathering. Marcus's calm and dignified handling of the situation had not only resolved the conflict, but left a lasting impression on everyone who witnessed it. And as the officers drove away, Mrs. Karen retreated to her house, her earlier smugness replaced by a heavy silence. As the officers walked into the backyard, the hum of murmured conversations filled the air. Marcus stood quietly, his calm yet commanding presence evident to everyone watching. Officer Miller glanced around, observing the neat rows of folding chairs, the half-filled plates of food on the table, and the basketball hoop where a stray ball lay forgotten. There was nothing out of place, no signs of disruption, just a family enjoying a summer afternoon. Officer Daniels, meanwhile, kept his eyes on Marcus. There was something about the man that seemed familiar, his posture, his composed demeanor, the way he carried himself. It all struck a chord. "You know," Daniels said, his tone shifting slightly, "you look familiar." He tilted his head, narrowing his eyes, as if trying to place the face. "Have we met before?" Marcus smiled faintly, his voice steady. "It's possible. I've lived here for years." Daniels nodded slowly, but didn't look convinced. He glanced at Miller. "Doesn't he look familiar to you?" Miller, caught off guard by the question, studied Marcus for a moment. His eyes widened slightly as recognition dawned. "Wait a minute," he said, his voice tinged with surprise. "You're Judge Thompson, aren't you?" A murmur rippled through the backyard as the name hung in the air. Marcus gave a small nod, his expression modest. "That's correct." Daniels blinked, clearly taken aback. "Judge Marcus Thompson?" he repeated, almost as if confirming it for himself. "I've read about you. You're the one who spearheaded that community outreach program for at-risk youth, right?" Marcus inclined his head slightly. "I've worked on a few initiatives in the community, yes. Helping young people stay on the right path is something I'm passionate about." Miller's demeanor shifted noticeably. The neutral professionalism he had maintained up until this point gave way to an air of respect. "Sir, I had no idea. Your name came up during one of our training sessions. We watched a clip of you speaking at the mayor's fundraiser last year." Daniels nodded enthusiastically. "And the Veterans Housing Initiative, you were part of that too, weren't you? My uncle got help through that program." Marcus took a deep breath as he stepped toward the gate, his movements steady and deliberate. The faint murmur of his family and guests behind him quieted, their eyes following his every move. LaToya stood nearby, her arms crossed protectively, while the children peeked out from behind her, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. As Marcus approached, the officers stopped just outside the gate, maintaining a neutral stance. The taller of the two, Officer Miller, offered a polite nod. "Good afternoon, sir," he began. "We received a call from a concerned neighbor about a potential disturbance in the area." Marcus maintained his calm demeanor, his voice measured and respectful. "Good afternoon, officers. This is my home. My family and I are just having a barbecue. Friends and family, nothing more." The shorter officer, Officer Daniels, glanced briefly over Marcus's shoulder, taking in the scene, a cheerful gathering of people enjoying food, music, and conversation. There was nothing remotely threatening about it. "That's what it looks like," Officer Miller acknowledged. "But since we were called, we're required to check things out. Can you tell us how many people are here today?" Marcus gestured casually to the group behind him. "Just a handful of family and a few close friends. We're not breaking any noise ordinances, and we've been mindful of the time and volume." Before the officers could respond, Mrs. Karen appeared at the edge of her driveway, striding purposefully toward the gate. Her face was flushed, whether from the summer heat or her rising indignation was unclear. "Officers!" she called out, injecting herself into the conversation. Marcus turned slightly, his expression remaining neutral as she approached. Mrs. Karen stopped a few feet from the officers, folding her arms across her chest. "I'm the one who called," she announced, her tone tinged with authority. "I've been listening to this all afternoon. The noise, the shouting, the music, it's completely disruptive." She turned her attention to the officers, her voice growing sharper. "And the smoke! Have you seen the amount of smoke coming from that grill? It's not safe, I'll tell you that. Who knows what they're burning back there?" LaToya, standing nearby, raised an eyebrow but held her tongue. Marcus, however, remained composed, his tone unwavering. "We're grilling food, ma'am. Nothing illegal or unsafe about that." Mrs. Karen ignored him, addressing the officers again. "I'm not exaggerating," she insisted. "This isn't just a little family gathering. There are so many people here. Too many for a backyard this size. It's completely out of control." Officer Daniels glanced toward Officer Miller, who subtly signaled for calm. Daniels turned back to Mrs. Karen. "Ma'am, we're here to ensure everything is safe and lawful. So far, we don't see any immediate cause for concern." Mrs. Karen's face reddened further, her voice rising slightly. "Are you kidding me? Just look at this. The noise, the smoke, the number of people. It's a public nuisance." Marcus took a step forward, his tone calm but firm. "Officers, we're a family enjoying a barbecue on a weekend afternoon. We've done nothing wrong, and there's no law against having a few guests over for a meal." Officer Miller nodded, his tone neutral but polite. "We understand, sir. Let's take a closer look to confirm everything is in order, and we'll resolve this quickly." As Mrs. Karen huffed in exasperation, Marcus gestured toward the backyard. "Please, feel free to have a look. You'll find nothing unusual here." Mrs. Karen's eyes darted between the officers and Marcus, her frustration mounting. She muttered under her breath, "We'll see about that." As the officers stepped into the backyard to assess the situation, the tension in the air grew thicker. Marcus stood tall, his calm exterior unwavering, even as he prepared to defend his family's right to simply enjoy their day. Before Marcus could respond, Mrs. Karen appeared, walking briskly toward the officers. Her expression was a mix of faux concern and self-assured authority. "Officers," she called out, "I'm the one who called. I just couldn't ignore it anymore. The noise has been going on for hours, and there's all this smoke. I wasn't sure if it was safe." LaToya's lips tightened as she stepped beside Marcus, her arms crossed. Jamal and Kayla stood a few feet away, their wide eyes fixed on the interaction. Marcus remained calm, his voice measured as he addressed the officers again. "We've been grilling, playing music, and enjoying our time together. Nothing out of the ordinary for a weekend afternoon. I don't think we're breaking any laws." The shorter officer nodded. "You're not," he said plainly. "But since there's been a complaint, we just need to confirm there's no issue." Mrs. Karen chimed in again, her tone sharp. "No issue? Officers, there's smoke everywhere. And just look at how many people are here. It's a disturbance, plain and simple." The taller officer turned to her, his expression patient but firm. "Ma'am, having a barbecue and playing music isn't against the law." Mrs. Karen bristled, opening her mouth to argue further, but the officer's attention shifted back to Marcus. As the conversation continued, the shorter officer suddenly took a closer look at Marcus. His eyes narrowed briefly before widening in recognition. "Wait a second," he said, tilting his head. "Aren't you Judge Thompson?" Marcus gave a small nod, his face calm but serious. "I am." The taller officer's demeanor shifted slightly as well. "Judge Marcus Thompson?" he asked, as if to confirm. Marcus nodded again. "That's right." A flicker of surprise passed between the officers. They exchanged a quick glance, their previous professionalism now tinged with respect. The taller officer cleared his throat, addressing Marcus with a hint of apology in his voice. "Sir, I didn't realize. I've read about your work, your contributions to the community." Mrs. Karen, standing off to the side, froze. Her smug expression faltered as she processed the revelation. "Judge," she whispered under her breath, her cheeks reddening. The officers straightened up. "There doesn't seem to be any problem here," the taller officer said firmly, turning to Mrs. Karen. "We've confirmed that everything is fine. There's no violation, no disturbance, and no reason for further action." Mrs. Karen stammered, her earlier confidence evaporating. But the noise..." The officer shook his head. "A gathering like this doesn't constitute a disturbance, ma'am." Marcus, still composed, turned to Mrs. Karen with a polite but pointed expression. "I hope this clears up any concerns you had," he said calmly. Mrs. Karen, now visibly embarrassed, mumbled something incoherent before retreating toward her house. The officers offered Marcus a handshake before heading back to their vehicles, their respect evident. As the police cars drove away, the Thompsons exchanged glances of relief. The backyard slowly returned to life, though the mood had shifted slightly, a mixture of triumph and quiet resilience settling over the family. And from her window, Mrs. Karen watched in silence, her face a mask of discomfort and regret. The faint sound of sirens approached, gradually rising above the chatter and music in the Thompsons' backyard. At first, no one paid it much attention. The laughter of the children and the occasional cheer from a friendly basketball game masked the growing noise. But as two police cars turned the corner and pulled up in front of the house, the atmosphere shifted. Marcus, standing at the grill with a pair of tongs in hand, noticed the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the windows of his house. He furrowed his brow, the easygoing smile on his face replaced by a look of confusion. "What's going on?" he murmured, setting the tongs down on a nearby tray. The guests began to notice, too. Conversations quieted and heads turned toward the street. The children paused their games, their excited voices giving way to murmurs of curiosity. LaToya, standing by the table arranging bowls of food, wiped her hands on a napkin and moved closer to Marcus. "Why are the police here?" she asked, her voice low but steady. "I don't know," Marcus replied calmly, though a flicker of concern passed across his face. The car doors opened and two officers stepped out. Their expressions were neutral, professional. The taller officer adjusted his belt and scanned the scene briefly before heading toward the open gate of the backyard. Inside her house, Mrs. Karen stood by the window, a satisfied smirk playing on her lips. She watched the scene unfold with keen interest, feeling a sense of vindication. "Finally," she muttered, straightening her blouse. As if on cue, she stepped outside, clutching a cardigan around her shoulders as though preparing for her role as a concerned neighbor. The officers reached the backyard fence, where Marcus stood waiting. He took a deep breath, exuding calm as he approached them. "Good afternoon, officers," he said in a steady voice. "How can I help you?" The taller officer glanced at his partner before addressing Marcus. "Good afternoon, sir. We received a call about a noise disturbance in the area. We're here to check on things." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his composure unwavering. "Noise disturbance?" he repeated, glancing back at the backyard where his family and friends were now gathered, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. "We're just having a barbecue. Family and friends. Nothing out of the ordinary." The officer nodded, his tone even. "That's what it looks like. But since we were called, we're required to investigate." She hesitated for a moment before dialing, her finger hovering over the screen. It wasn't the first time she'd considered calling the authorities on her neighbors, but today felt different. In her mind, the Thompsons were being deliberately disruptive, testing her limits. With a deep breath, she pressed the call button. 911. "What's your emergency?" came the calm voice on the other end. Mrs. Karen adjusted her tone, adopting a mix of concern and exasperation. "Yes. Hello. I'd like to report a disturbance," she began. The dispatcher asked for details, and Mrs. Karen wasted no time painting a vivid picture of the so-called problem. "It's my neighbors. They're hosting some sort of gathering. It's loud. There are a lot of people, and the smell of smoke is overwhelming. It doesn't seem safe at all." The dispatcher's tone remained professional. "Can you describe what you mean by unsafe? Are there any immediate threats or illegal activities?" Mrs. Karen hesitated. She hadn't thought that far ahead. "Well, I don't know what they're up to," she said vaguely. "But there are a lot of them. It looks suspicious." "Suspicious in what way, ma'am?" Her annoyance flared. Why was she being questioned when she was the one seeking help? "Look," she snapped. "All I know is they're causing a disruption, and something needs to be done about it. Isn't it your job to investigate?" The dispatcher calmly assured her that an officer would be sent to check on the situation. Mrs. Karen ended the call with a satisfied nod, already imagining how the scene would play out. She pictured the officers arriving, the Thompsons scrambling to explain themselves, and the noise finally dying down. Feeling vindicated, she returned to her perch by the window, watching the festivities with a smug expression. She imagined herself as a hero of the neighborhood, the one who had the courage to stand up for peace and quiet. As the minutes ticked by, the sound of laughter and music continued unabated. Mrs. Karen drummed her fingers on the windowsill, growing impatient. "They'll see," she muttered to herself. "They think they can do whatever they want, but there are rules in this neighborhood." The faint sound of sirens in the distance brought a triumphant smile to her lips. She leaned closer to the window, craning her neck to get a better view. Moments later, 2 police cars pulled up to the curb in front of the Thompsons' house. The chatter in the backyard quieted as the officers stepped out of their vehicles. The children stopped playing, their curious eyes fixed on the uniformed figures. Marcus, ever composed, wiped his hands on a towel and moved toward the gate to greet the officers. From her vantage point, Mrs. Karen watched with satisfaction as the scene unfolded. She imagined Marcus fumbling for words, trying to justify the raucous gathering. She anticipated the officers stepping in to restore order, perhaps even shutting down the barbecue altogether. But as she watched, something unexpected happened. The officers didn't immediately confront Marcus. Instead, there was a pause, a moment of recognition on one of their faces. Mrs. Karen squinted, trying to make sense of what was happening. Her satisfaction began to waver as she noticed the calm and respectful way Marcus interacted with the officers. One of them even shook his hand, their conversation carrying an air of familiarity. Mrs. Karen's triumphant smile faltered. "What's going on?" she muttered under her breath, her smugness giving way to confusion. From the corner of her eye, she saw one of the officers glance in her direction, a subtle but unmistakable look that made her stomach twist. Unbeknownst to Mrs. Karen, her carefully constructed narrative was about to unravel, and the lesson she was about to learn would leave her utterly speechless. It was a perfect sunny weekend, the kind that made you want to be outdoors, soaking in the warmth and celebrating life. In the backyard of a modest but well-kept home, the sound of sizzling meat on the grill mixed with bursts of laughter and cheerful chatter. The Thompson family was hosting their annual summer barbecue, a tradition they cherished and one that always brought the family closer. Marcus Thompson, the head of the family, stood confidently at the grill, expertly flipping burgers and ribs while wearing his signature grill master apron. His wife, LaToya, moved gracefully between the outdoor table and the kitchen, preparing sides and ensuring everyone had what they needed. Their teenage son, Jamal, played basketball with his younger sister, Kayla, while a few cousins joined in the fun. A game of tag unfolded on the grass, kids' laughter ringing out like music in the air. The guests, a mix of family and close friends, lounged in chairs under a canopy, swapping stories and enjoying cold drinks. The atmosphere was lively yet peaceful, a perfect snapshot of a close-knit community sharing a moment of joy. But not everyone appreciated the scene. From the window of the house next door, Mrs. Karen watched with an expression of thinly veiled annoyance. The hum of conversation, the occasional burst of music, and even the fragrant smoke drifting from the grill seemed to irritate her. She tapped her manicured fingers on the windowsill, muttering complaints under her breath. The scene was a sharp contrast, a vibrant family celebration on one side and a disapproving solitary figure on the other. As the Thompsons laughed and cheered, oblivious to her watchful gaze, Mrs. Karen's irritation only grew. From the moment the first burst of laughter escaped the Thompsons' backyard, Mrs. Karen felt her patience slipping away. Sitting alone in her pristine living room, the faint beats of music and the clatter of voices seeped through the walls like an unwelcome guest. She sighed dramatically, tossing her book onto the coffee table. "They're at it again," she muttered, glaring out the window at the lively scene unfolding next door. Mrs. Karen prided herself on maintaining peace and order in the neighborhood. A retired librarian, she often referred to herself as the unofficial guardian of the block. Noise, activity, and anything out of the ordinary were, in her mind, threats to the quiet life she cherished. Today, the Thompsons' barbecue was the target of her ire. The steady hum of their music grated on her nerves, and the sight of children running and shouting filled her with an inexplicable irritation. The smell of charcoal smoke wafting through the air was the final straw. Wrinkling her nose, she muttered, "It smells like they're burning half the neighborhood down." Mrs. Karen paced the length of her living room, glancing at the clock as if waiting for the chaos to subside. But the laughter grew louder, and the music shifted to an upbeat tune that sent a ripple of cheers through the crowd. She peeked through her blinds, her sharp eyes narrowing as she took in the sight of Marcus Thompson flipping burgers and chatting animatedly with a group of friends. "I've had enough of this," she declared, grabbing her phone.